All right, so this video will focus on 1.3. And before we get started, just like usual, please pause the video and try to solve the various questions up here. All right, so now that you've solved it, we're looking at like 45 and you're taking away 11, right? So if we go here, I have 34, 64, 77, 7, 45, and then finally 2. And this is pretty easy. We've been doing this for a number of years. The harder ones may have been 5 or 6, but still, I mean, if you take 87 minus 29, get an answer, then subtract 13. Pretty easy stuff. So our essential question today is, how are we adding integers and subtracting integers, or how is it related? So if I look here, this looks similar to last chapter, and I have 4 positive counters, and I want to remove how many? Because it says here 4 minus, or take away 2. So I have to actually get rid of 2 of them. I'm just going to lift them up or cross them off, and I'm just left with 2 other ones. So 4 minus 2 equals, another way is I have this, and I have 4, and I have 2 negative counters. So this is the other way I can do it. So I have my 4 that I have on here. I'm now going to put 2 counters on, which represent subtraction. So I have like these 2 here, and they will cancel each other out, because if I have plus 1 and minus 1, that equals 0. And another plus 1 and minus 1, and I get 0. So I'm just left with 2 left. So the answer is equal to 2. I have 2 positives that are left on the board. Next one is, so of course 4 plus the opposite of 2, which is the same as 4 plus negative 2, equals 2. We do this again with the number line. So I'm going to have negative 3. So I start off at 0, have to go over to the left 3, and then I'm going to subtract 1 more. Well, subtracting, of course, means 1 unit to the left. So altogether, I started at 0, and now I am at negative 4. I take the absolute value, if they're both the same. So I could take like negative 3, and then I could take negative 1. We can add them together, and I get absolute value of negative 4, which we know equals 4. Just another way to do this. So it says write the addition expression. So I'm going to have my negative 3, and then I'm going to add. But what's actually happening here? What direction am I traveling in? To the left. And how do you represent a number to the left? So I put negative 3 minus 1, and that equals negative 4 as well. So really quickly, I want to go back. So this one here, if I look at it, this is a subtraction sentence. See how there's no plus sign here? It's just negative 3 and negative 1. And that answer was negative 4. And that's the same thing as negative 3 plus negative 1. They mean exactly the same thing. So how could you explain, or how would you use integer counters to model 4 minus 6? So if you think about 4 counters, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And then I have 6 negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh boy, sorry about that one. But in any case, these will cancel out. And remember, this was actually 2 of them, right? So the answer equals 2, but they're the negative sign, so it's negative 2. So now I want you to take a moment, and I want you to try to figure these out. All right, so now you've given it a try. And so I have 5, that's where I start from. And I'm going to the left 8, so I have negative 3. Number 2 is a little tricky, right? Because I'm going 12, and I'm subtracting the opposite of negative 3. Well, what's the opposite of negative 3? It's positive 3. So if I'm doing, it's an opposite of an opposite, essentially, which is a positive. So 12 plus 3 is 15. This one here, I have negative and negative becomes a positive, because we're right next to each other. So negative 5 plus 6 is 1. Negative 4 minus 6, both of them are traveling in the same direction to the left, and this equals negative 10. 9 minus 16, so I'm at 9, and I go to the left 16, so I'm at negative 7. And then negative 7 minus 10, which is negative 17. So let's just take a look at this, because I know some of these are a little tricky. So if I have to subtract an integer, add its opposite. So if I have like 3 minus 4, that's the same thing as taking 3 plus negative 4. They mean exactly the same thing. And in both cases, the answer equals -1. So here I'm subtracting 4. I'm adding, or so I add 3 first of all. That's what this represents. 3. And then I go backwards 4. And that's how I get to -1. This represents this one here. And then this one over here, I add -4. So I'm sorry, I start with 3. And then I have to add a negative, which goes to the left, 4. And I also get to -1. So these mean exactly the same thing. They're the same exact answer. So now it says find 3 minus 12. So you can do this a couple different ways. You can do the number line way. So if I go, I have my 0. I have 3. But now I have to go over to the left 12. And I add the opposite of 12, right, which is -12. So 3 minus 12 is -9. So the difference is -9. Do the same thing here. So find -8 minus a negative. So think about this. You're subtracting the opposite of 13. Well, that's subtracting the opposites like they're both opposites, right? So it becomes a positive. A negative and a negative becomes a positive when they're right next to each other. So add the opposite of -13, which is 13. So I have -8 plus 13. And the difference here is, and then finally I have 5 minus the negative. Well, what's the opposite of a negative? I mean, it's a positive, right? So 5 plus 4 is 9. Subtract 8 minus 3, 9 minus 17, and -3 minus 3. So 8 minus 3, of course, is 5. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was more. -14 minus 9. 9 minus, okay, these are good, okay. So 8 minus 3 is 5. Oh, there's all of them. All right, so the trickier ones, the ones that some people get confused by are like number 5 and number 4. So remember, number 4 is you owe somebody $14, you owe them $9, altogether you owe them $23. Notice how this one is different, even though they both have negative signs, than this one here. The negative signs here are right next to each other. It's like you're multiplying a negative times a negative. See how they're right next to each other? Not like this. There's a number in between, right? So this becomes the opposite of a negative is a positive, and that's why 9 plus 8 is 17. And in this case, -14 minus 9 is -23. This one here is a combination of the two, right? I have -12, but then I have a -12. Well, the opposite of -12 is +12. And that's that additive inverse thing. So it's going to be -12 plus 12 is equal to 0. So evaluate this one here, if we look here. So I usually rewrite this, and I'll put down -7 plus, because negative and a -12 is plus 12. And then minus 14. And if I look here, I'm going to combine the two negatives together, and I'll have -21 plus 12. And when I do that, I get -9 as my answer. So just another way to do this here. All right, so evaluate this expression here. I have -9, -16, and -8. You're going to add all three of these numbers together. And for all these, you're going to do this. So I'm going to give you a moment to take a look at them, try to solve them, and then press play on the video. And here are all the various answers. It says, which continent has the greater range in elevation? Now, range means the lowest to the highest, the difference, right? So I'm going to take this, and I know that I'm at, let's just make a number line. So I have -86. I'm doing this one first. And I'm going all the way over to 6198. And we know in between the negative and the positive, there has to be a 0. That's what changes it from a negative to a positive. So from -86 to 0 is 86. And then from 0 to 6198, if I add these two together, so I'm going to take 6198 plus 86. So I'm going to have 41816. So 6,284. And this one will do the exact same thing, where I'll take -155 to 0 to 5895. Figure that out. That's where I got that 6284. Do this one over here, do the exact same thing. And I'm going to have 6,050 whenever I would actually figure this out. I didn't do it yet. The highest elevation in Mexico is 5,700 meters. The lowest elevation is -10. So what's the range between the elevations? So I'm going to go from -10 to 5,700. And we know that this is really going to be written two different ways. I can either write it as 5,700 minus a -10. And we know that the negative and the negative becomes a positive. So I have 5,710. Or I can do it the way I was doing it before, where I take -10, put a 0 here, and then 5,700. And this is 10. And then this is 5,700. So altogether it'll be 5,710, which is the answer. So two different ways to write it. And then finally it says, your friend is homesick today. Imagine you're on the telephone. How do you explain the subtract integers? What do you do? Give an example. So think about that. Write it down.